Hey guys, I am Susanna. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications at Adventure Science Center, and today we are digging into the science under the surface of coffee, brewing, fermentation, everything that goes into making a cup of coffee that you have every day. But this is really unlike anything else because we're here at Elixr Coffee. Our friend Winston Justice introduced us to his brother-in-law, Evan Inatome, who we're going to chat with here in a little bit and learn lots of fascinating things about a cup of coffee unlike anything else you've ever had. Hey, Evan, thanks so much for doing this with us today. We're excited to learn a little bit more about Elixr and all of the cool things you guys have going on here. So let's go take a seat and dive into it.
All right, let's go.
Check it out.
Obviously, you are a lover of coffee, but what was the moment, or how did you get really into the art of coffee and roasting? What really attracted you to this world?
It was really after college when I was living in Sumatra, northern Indonesia, which has a tremendous, really rich coffee culture. When I got back here stateside, that's when I figured out the specialty side of things, how interesting coffee can be. All these regions are so different, they're tasting so interesting. And it was a natural process Ethiopian coffee that I tried from Stumptown back in probably 2006 that really blew my mind, and that's when I started going down that rabbit hole.
The coffee bean itself is a part of a berry, or that's like a cherry in the tree? Like what exactly, because it's a fruit,
looks like a
technically,
cherry.
right?
Yeah. It looks like a cherry. Inside is, what we're drinking is actually the pit.
Right.
It's a little pit, but it's still covered in a slimy coating, and that's called the mucilage. You'd have to ferment that off. So they would put it in water for maybe 18 hours, depending on how cold it is. And then if it's soaking in that fermentation with the bacteria, after it's done, it will just slough right off, and then they wash it again, and then you have a coffee seed that doesn't have any sticky coating, and then they put it on the drying patio to dry. And drying is also very important because if it dries too fast, you have a high water activity level, and it will degrade too fast. So it really also needs to be dry probably between 8 and 20 days. If it's dried in like 3 or 4 days, it's too fast.
Got it. And because I know that you guys do some different fermented coffees here, is that just a distilling process?
In order to get the coffee to taste differently, they would plant different varieties of coffee. But very recently, people have started to experiment and imparting more fruit, more different fruit-like qualities in the cup by how it's fermented, drying it in that mucilage. So that would be called the honey process. And so when they would dry it in that mucilage, that mucilage would kind of get a really sticky covering, and they called it honey. And that imparted more fruit-like characteristics on the coffee. One of the farms that we've been working with was really on the forefront. It's called Palma El Tucan in Colombia. They started experimenting with anaerobic fermentations, so bacteria that flourish without oxygen. And they realized that the coffee tastes a lot more fruity when you process it that way.
So once you get the beans here, it's already been through all of that process. So what part of the process of brewing or creating coffee actually happen on site at your stores?
Once we buy the coffee, it will arrive at a warehouse in New Jersey. So we bring it in, we roast it. And the way we roast it really depends on a lot of different things too. Just to summarize it, my goal as a roaster is to really balance the raw sugars with the caramelized sugars. And the most acid and raw sugar a coffee has is when it's still green. The acid kind of develops and breaks down. Same with the sugars, develops and breaks down as it gets hotter. But you really want to maximize the perceived sweetness, and I think that happens when there's a good balance between raw sugars and caramelized sugars. That tends to happen right around first crack of the coffee, and that's because when first crack happens, there's still some moisture in the coffee that's like violently leaving the coffee.
What's first crack?
So coffee, it's green, it's small. When the water leaves, it starts to brown up. It expands actually, almost like a popcorn. it will actually pop the bean and it'll crack it.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's that process, the moisture coming out of the coffee. And that's when right around when first crack is ending is when you're gonna get the most perceived sweetness.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine too, just even keeping track of the water that's involved in the process can affect the flavor of the coffee too. Like whether it's a highly mineralized water or doesn't have as much water or it's distilled. And thinking through like just as a normal coffee drinker, even just putting tap water in the coffee machine can change the flavor of the coffee itself.
Oh yeah. So I can explain to you what my thoughts are on that, and I will say it's different from the rest of the industry. Okay. Yes. So basically, you take the water, you can filter with a carbon filter, and that will take the taste and odor out of the water. What that won't do is lower or affect the total dissolved solids, that we call that the TDS, in the water itself, which will inhibit how easy or hard it is to extract that coffee. So if you imagine like a sponge, a dry sponge will obviously soak a lot more water than a wet sponge.
Sure.
So if you have a water with a low TDS, it's gonna be way easier to extract and dissolve that coffee. So the typical school of thought is coffee tastes best when it's about 150 TDS, but I'd take it way down to about 25 TDS at my shops. And then I run it through this is called a calcite filter, which increases the pH, and that's only because I don't want it hurting our machines. But I think it's better to have a lower TDS, lower than almost everybody would say, because you will be able to pull out a lot more flavors out of the coffee. So if you're brewing at home, I would recommend brewing with either distilled water or adding a little bit of filtered water to that distilled water to brew, as opposed to just using filtered right out of the fridge or something like that.
Pro tip. I mean, because again, the average person walks into a store and they know they're getting a great cup of coffee, but they definitely don't understand all of the details that go into it.
There's a lot that goes into it. It's very difficult to execute at home.
If you want the best cup of coffee at home without all of the equipment and all of the investment, what's the right way to do it?
The first thing I would recommend is a scale, because that will not only help you get the ratio of coffee correct, but it'll help you figure out the extraction like we talked about. I would spend $100 on entry-level Baratza grinder. And it's a bird grinder that tries to make a fairly consistent grind. And then lastly is a kettle that will heat up to about 200 degrees. If you can get 200 degrees, a decent grinder and a scale, that's most of the battle. And then if you can get distilled water when you're brewing, you're gonna get coffee as close to how we do it here.
Nice. Well, I'd love to try some stuff and get a couple of different sips of some different things we've talked about.
All right. We do at Elixr 22 grams of coffee for 340 grams of water. Most specialty shops like ours will do 15 or 16 to 1, somewhere around that range. And that's to say water to coffee, 15 times the water. So basically, the first thing I'm going to do, and you can kind of see that actually it's bubbling. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is the CO2 inside the gases during the roasting process are kind of just coming out during the initial pour of coffee. You kind of want to give it about 30 seconds to bloom, we call it. After 30 seconds, we do our first main pour. Most places will agitate quite a lot, but they also have a much coarser grind.
And when you say agitate, what exactly do you mean?
Using the water as I'm pouring to really mix the coffee. So I'm going right in the center, almost no agitation at all. That's only because we grind so fine. If we ground a lot coarser, we would do a lot more agitation. So that's just our technique here at Elixr. I'm gonna pour a little bit of our batch brew for you to try first. Just a standard, fairly round, kind of interesting, but not super interesting coffee.
That's so
just
good.
basic.
Yeah, that's delicious.
And now I'm gonna pour for you a coffee that we're about to release. We haven't released it yet, actually.
Ooh, first access.
This is a really fantastic coffee from Ethiopia. It's fermented with yeast. It's gonna have all kinds of wild, really nice fruity-like flavors. You can smell it.
It smells good.
And so yeah, this is
Whoa, yeah, you can totally taste the difference too.
and now we're gonna try the anaerobic coffee. And this had an anaerobic fermentation for about 2 days. It's from Colombia, and you can tell it's gonna have a lot more fruit-like characteristics.
You can smell it too, yeah.
In the coffee. So you're gonna have all kinds of fruity-like flavors.
It definitely has a tea sort of essence to it. Man, and this just goes to show too, like, people who love tons of sugar and cream in their coffees too, if you're really having like a super good cup of coffee, so much of that is unnecessary because it would take away from the natural flavor of this.
Because that's what we spend so much time and effort finding unique coffees, roasting it to kind of showcase that uniqueness. So that's kind of it.
So I am caffeinated beyond any reasonable measure. It's been a really great experience here today at Elixr, learning about brewing, roasting, fermentation, all kinds of amazing things that go into the process of the cup of joe you have every morning to get your day started, and maybe a few times throughout the day as well, no judgment. I'm Susanna, and this has been another episode of Science Under the Surface for Adventure Science Center. Thanks for tuning in.